Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this web training dedicated to designing and managing a project. Thank you very much for your participation. This training is co-organized by Conservatoire du Littoral, which is the French Coastal Conservation Agency, SMILO NGO that I work for, which is an NGO dedicated to sustainable development on small islands, and the PIM Initiative, French NGO working on very small islands in the Mediterranean. Next slide, please. So today we will have three speakers presenting and sharing their experience in how to design a project proposal and how to prepare a project proposal. So I will let these three speakers present briefly themselves. Grégory.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Guanel. I am the director for the Caribbean Green Technology Center at the University of the Virgin Islands. I'm also a coastal engineer, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Grégory. Alexander, or can you present yourself? If Alexander is not available, Farah, yeah. Farah, can you please, yes, Alexander, can you please present yourself?
Is that me? I'm having some connection issues. So let me know if you can hear me.
Yes. Yes, Alexander, can you please introduce yourself?
Everyone, I'm on.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
We are having some. Okay, so just very quickly, my name is Alexander Lamont Bishop. I'm Deputy Secretary General of INTO, which is a network national trust.
Thank you, Alexander. And we have also Stuart, who joined us and who will be moderating this training today.
Everyone, sorry about the technical difficulties. Welcome to everybody. And this in a series of three with our guests as well. Domitila, I'm not sure how many people we got to get introduced. I see that Alex is also having technical problems, not as bad as mine, but have we had a chance to get any further than the first couple slides here?
We have just started the training, and Grégory and Alexander presented themselves, and I also presented myself, and we are just missing the introduction from Farah.
Okay, Farah, want to introduce yourself quickly, and I'll mention them a bit more later as we get into their presentations.
Hello, I'm Farah Mukita. I'm the Executive Director of the Anguilla National Trust.
Great, and we will hear from each of the speakers. Hopefully Alex will be able to reconnect. And Domitila, let me know if my connection is not good. It seems like everything is fine now. So welcome to our participants, and again, apologies for the late start. I am Stuart Sarkozy-Bonacy, and I'm one of the presenters and moderators for the panel today and into October and November. Very glad you could join us from so many different places in the world. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and for some of you, good night. So this is in a series of webinars that have been conducted by the Conservatoire and their various partners and funders. The first one you may go back and see the recordings of was a series of them done in French around natural spaces and islands. This is the first of the three related to designing and managing a project in a natural area. And in particular, I know that we have from our registration, islands, small islands, and a whole group of coastal organizations. So really glad to have you join us from such far-flung locations. And we'll talk about the next series at the very end so that you're ready to do the October and November sessions where we'll have another set of speakers. But you should all then have access to the technical guide, which we'll refer to today in short form, and the certificate of participation by running through all of them. So again, welcome. Next slide. So I mentioned myself, Domitille had a chance while I was dealing with the technology problems herself. And in the background is Fanny, who I always want to say a word about because many of the issues that we have and technology problems are solved by Fanny, and also she deals with all the registration and that kind of thing. So really want to make sure that we mention the support behind the camera as we do these. Next slide. So for those of you participating, it's a little bit of a different setup. We ask you to use the question box. Some of you will be on chat. Domitille and I, but especially Domitille, as I'm presenting and our guest speakers are presenting, will be monitoring that. And when we get to the Q&A section, we'll halt and pull out your questions. And we can try to keep the conversation going. There's also the open kind of forum Q&A and discussion at the end, which I hope everyone will stay on for and contribute to with the speakers. And of course, the speakers are able to be seen and heard, and we'll have them turn their cameras on and off. We have one set of slides from Alex, hoping he joins again, and then we'll run through a short set of the slides from the two first phases that come out of the guidebook that I referenced. Next slide. So the way that the agenda will run today is I'll just set the stage a little bit of the work and the guide and the process and a bit of the background. We will hear from each of our three speakers and stakeholders, and then we will run into each of the two phases that I mentioned. The first one being the choosing the donor and call for proposals, and then the second one, designing the project draft and supervising the application. And so as we're going through that, be sure to post questions. As I noted, these are the guidebook is quite lengthy, and so we will not spend a great deal of time running through each of the sections and each of the points in them. We'll just have the Q&A, and you'll have the guidebook to reference yourself. And then at the very end, we'll have the live Q&A and kind of open forum with all of you. Next slide. So first, just a little bit about projects. The question of what a project is can sometimes be confusing. I work in this field along with so many of you, and we have this discussion quite a bit because programs, projects, and words like that get interchanged. And also some initiatives or big projects can have multiple parts that then get sent off and referred to with other what are essentially sub-projects, but might have an entire plan in and of themselves. So the way that we're using the working definition here is that we have a definition on the screen. And this is more or less how I like to think of it as well, is that we have a combination of activities which relate to deliverables, and we have a very defined strategic objective, i.e. what is going to be our impact. And so inside that though, and we'll touch on this, are the various results and deliverables, outputs, outcomes, the calendar and timing, and things like, of course, the budget and the roles that are played in it. And in those roles, when we talk about managing a project, it's usually someone that is running the entire thing and they're organizing and implementing it, either as an organization, if it's a very small organization and it's just you or just you and a couple of people, or you have a much larger organization with multiple projects, multiple programs, and they're assigned as you do the programmatic development that we'll talk about today and over the next two webinars. And that's moving it towards the success that is stated in your application and the ability to hit your numbers and the timing in the calendar. Next slide. And just a note here, because we'll talk a lot about the way that we do these projects and the various parts of them in very short form compared to what's in the guidebook. And what we need to think about too is both the stages that we're going to run through over the next 3 months in the 3 webinars, but also all of you know for sure, like any of us that are on, that this is not always linear. It's not always a straightforward process, and that you might have phases that kind of circle back on each other, or we don't want to think about this, but perhaps you don't get the application in right away successfully, and you have to come back to it. So there may even be a timing scale and capacity inside your organization, and not thinking of it as too linear, and that there's a cyclical or circular function to this as we do this work. It also may mean that the capacity of the organization has to be such that you shouldn't even apply for something like one of these calls that comes out, or approach a foundation or other funder if you don't have that capacity. And so that realistic check is part of what we'll talk about today, because you don't want to, and I'll mention it more than a few times, we don't want to just chase grants. We want to do this in a strategic way and be ready to do it. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about the 2 first phases, and really think about what it means to design that project and prepare the application. And again, there are multiple stages inside this. We can't cover all of them, but we'll touch on the high points, and through the guidebook, that'll help steer you through it as well. Next slide. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. And sorry, I'm not moving them myself. So, and then in October, we'll cover the next 2 phases that are in the guidebook, and in November, the last phase. And again, these don't always go in a straight linear order. They might go in a little bit of a cyclical direction, but the idea is that over these 3 webinars, we're working on all the elements to get you from thinking about a project, applying and running it, and monitoring evaluation on it. So we'll come to these in the next 2 months. Next slide. Great. So you heard from a couple of our speaker stakeholders, and I just wanted to briefly introduce them. Please definitely feel like there are experts in the room for today, for the next couple of hours. And also their information is kind of on the ground, real life experience. We have Alexander Bishop, who is the Deputy Secretary General for INTO, the International National Trust Organization, and he'll have a couple of slides. And following Alex, we'll have Farah Mukida, who is the Executive Director of the Anguilla National Trust, and then Greg Guinell, the Director of the Caribbean Green Technology Center at the University of the Virgin Islands. And all coming at this from slightly different angles to help you think through this first section of the training. Next slide. So what we'll do now is, as I noted in the agenda, we'll have each of the three speakers run through their short presentations. Then we'll come back to the core content, and then we'll do some Q&A and go to the second part of the core content. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who has a few slides, and I hope was able to reconnect. Alex, are you there?
I am. I'm not going to turn my webcam on, but I'm going to check that you can hear me. Just confirm for me that you can hear me okay.
I can hear you great right now.
Good. So I am the presenter at the moment. If this doesn't work, I will stop sharing my screen, and perhaps Farah or Greg can take over and do the presentation, and we can work out another person sharing screen because something's not quite working with the software. But anyway, for the moment it is working, so let's move. Please let me know by chat or by interrupting me if I am no longer audible.
Okay.
Hello everyone. My name is Alex Lamont Bishop. For the introduction, for the opportunity to speak. It's always a pleasure to present at these kind of events. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of INTO, which is, as was mentioned, the International National Trust Organisation. But what does that mean? INTO is a network of national trusts. National trusts, many of you will know. You'll hear more from Farah as well, who is part of our network. But national trusts are organisations that care for natural and cultural heritage for everyone. That's some data about our network all over the world. We've actually now. We exist to share knowledge between those members, to bring them together, to work on shared areas of shared concern, we run a conference, all the things that you'd expect from a body that represents organisations caring for heritage globally. We also run a number of programs. We run grants programs for our members. We do projects, which we'll hear more about. I've just finished this week delivering an incubator, which is a program for organizations that want to know more about the model. And we do run webinars as well. And it's just some examples of projects here that I wanted to touch on while I just wrap up talking about INTO. These are the kind of projects that we bring our members together to work on. You'll see middle left here, because you can see it on my screen, is an example of a project with a focus on climate, working in East Africa. It's now grown also to be in Tanzania. And it's interesting from the perspective of what we're here to talk about today, that INTO does bring together our members to work together on projects. So in terms of the life cycle of applying for and delivering projects, which we're all here to talk about, that's something that we collaborate with our members on significantly. To talk about that a little bit more, in the last couple of years, we've raised about 800,000 US in various different partner projects that bring together our members from around the world. 17 of those have been involved in projects. That's things that are working on cultural and natural heritage, because national trusts are, one thing that typifies a natural trust is that they will do both. And I also just wanted, Stuart did ask me if I could also represent slightly something which comes from my own background. I personally have a background working at funding bodies, so giving out money. It was more in the cultural space than the natural, which we're here to discuss today, but a lot of that is transferable from one sector to another. My particular expertise is around social development assistance funding, and largely from public sources. And I've allocated and then gone on to monitor grants everywhere from $5,000 to $4 million in scale, largely in the cultural space, but not entirely. Just a few thoughts then on the subject matter for today, which is all about project design and application. And I've at Stuart's request, I've kind of positioned the perspective of a funder. These are not maybe revelatory to all of you, but they are a starting point, I think, for our conversation today. when you're thinking about applying for funding and you're in that early stage, for me, the most important thing to think about is bringing together and it often is a coalition, a partnership of organizations to work together on project delivery and then even on project creation. The main reason why we all do that, of course, is that track record is absolutely paramount, and you need, according to what according to your own strategic objectives, but also what the funder wants to see, you will need to be able to evidence certain things existing within your project partnership, and it is only possible for the very, very biggest organizations that they have all the expertise they need, all the track record they need already on hand within their organization. We're here also, of course, at the kind invitation of the SMILO network. So if we're talking small islands, I'm imagining that we're also talking small organizations, and thinking about some of the bigger scale of grants, the process where you come at that is definitely one of partnerships. If you're a small organization and you don't have a track record in delivering projects to a budget in excess of $100,000 or in excess of $1 million, you need to build up to that level. And the place to start is with a partnership with an organization that does have that track record. A few other reflections. My background is in, you can probably hear that I'm British, but I've worked at government-funded funds in different countries around the world, and I think it is fair to say that if you are applying to a fund where the source money is governmental, and that source money is from a government of a specific country, they would usually prefer, particularly if you're using international expertise, if you are using international expertise, it is always worth considering finding a partner in the target country where the money comes from. That might feel very obvious, but it is almost always a consideration for funders. And I say that of places I've worked, but also of things I know of how it works in other parts of the world as well. But what's important to consider then, if you're an organization on a small island and you've got something which is absolutely manifestly important that you need to do to protect your natural environment, but you don't have the track record to bid for and deliver your grant, there is no reason why you cannot go into a partnership where the delivery of the project activity is handled largely by the small organization on island. And the main responsibility actually for the organization that does the bidding, which is bigger, has the track record, is about grant management and making that partnership happen. Just because 80% of project budget is being spent by the smaller organization doesn't mean that it needs to be the lead partner. And what you should prioritize, in my opinion, is the partnership structure that will allow you to have the most success with fundraising. And finally, a last point, which I hope you'll all appreciate since you've come here today, representing a network and also at the invitation of things like SMILO, that's what opportunities like this are for in many ways. Meet your partners and get together as part of a network. Finds the organisation that complements what you've got on in your, whether it's expertise or expertise that you need to unlock specific kinds of funding. Go along to by people like SMILO and meet with whom you can work and the application. I've had to be able to have my camera on, but that's the end of my slides. I really hope you've all been able to hear me, and I'm going to back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Alex. That was great. And until just the very last few seconds, it was much, much better. And I really appreciate you picking up moving the slides, given the other technology problems we've had. So that's great. A fantastic setup. We'll move to Farah. I'm glad that Alex mentioned the partnerships piece. If I look a little bleary-eyed, one of my roles is around partnerships, and I was up late doing a funding proposal. And sometimes the partnerships piece of the funding is the most important to work out ahead of time. And as Alex pointed out, if you're a small organization, that may be the way that you have to do it fiscally, or even just in terms of delivery and capacity, like I mentioned at the very beginning. So with that, let's move to Farah and to the Caribbean. Farah, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Thank you. I'm also going to keep my camera off because of our Wi-Fi issues. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm the Executive Director of the Anguilla National Trust. I've been with the organization for the last 16 years. And the National Trust is a statutory body. So we were created by law by the government of Anguilla with a mandate to protect, conserve, and promote Anguilla's natural, cultural, and built heritage. So we're a pretty small organization. We have we have 8 staff members, and we're engaged in work that includes applied research, habitat and species conservation, island restoration, protected areas management, and public awareness. And so we do receive a small grant from the government, which covers about 1/3 of our overall budget and almost all of our operational overheads. And it also obviously includes some salaries, and then meaning mine and our admin manager. But we have extensive programs, and most of that work is actually covered through external funding, which also covers 6 of our staff members' salaries. So fundraising through proposal writing is absolutely critical to our operations, but we have been fortunate to have been able to raise about $3 million US over the last 10 years to support on-the-ground conservation work. So I'll speak more about sort of our process in terms of developing proposals. And the way we first start the process is based on a few different things. So one of the main things we want to do is assess our needs and work program areas, and then we'll draft basic 1-page concept notes that include very rough estimates of implementation costs, which can then be used to support the development of full project proposals. But I'll be honest, that actually takes quite a bit of time, and it doesn't usually happen because I'm just not always that organized. So things tend to kick more into gear when we receive or find notices of grant opportunities. And then the absolute first thing we have to check is to see whether or not we're even eligible to apply. Anguilla is a UK overseas territory, which means that our funding options are somewhat limited. And then once we're able to apply, we'll then look at the conditions of the grant in terms of the grant focus and what the funder is willing to support. We assess how it fits into our strategic plan and our ongoing projects and programs, and whether we're allowed to build in staff time into the budget, because that is primarily how we are able to pay our staff. We also have to look at the amount that we're able to apply for, because sometimes we need to make sure that we have enough liquid capital available to fund project expenses if project payments are made as reimbursements. And if we're not, similar to what Alex said, is we then have to look to see if we can partner with other organizations who have more of that type of capacity to manage the projects. We also consider reporting requirements and even what's required within the proposal application. So how onerous is that application process, and whether it's worth the time and effort to even prepare it. And then when we actually start writing our proposal, we tend to complete log frame or logical frameworks, which outline the project impact and the outcomes, the outputs, indicators, means of verification, sometimes the assumptions, and of course the activities. And we complete these log frames regardless of whether or not they're required by the project or within the project proposal. And then also, although not explicit within the log frame, by completing this process, it gets you thinking about the theory of change, which seems to be becoming a standard component of most project proposal applications now. So the log frame takes probably the most amount of time to complete, but once it's done, the proposal application becomes pretty straightforward because we've already given thought to what it is that we really want to accomplish, how we'll do it, what we need to do it, and that also helps with costing out the activities. So many grant funding agencies have specific application templates, and almost all of them have word limits to the various sections, which means that we have to be really concise and precise in our narratives. And we have to leave enough time for multiple revisions just to make sure we're capturing exactly what it is that we want to say within a very limited amount of space. We also find it, as Alex said, extremely helpful to work in partnership, not just in terms of actually implementing projects, but also in creating these project proposals. So internally, we work amongst ourselves to develop the project concept and to review the proposal, but then also externally, we will ask our partners and colleagues to review proposals for us as well. So having that extra set of eyes that aren't so invested into the project is really helpful, because they may see gaps or inconsistencies in our logic. And then through our experience with fundraising and then project implementation, we've also become increasingly wary, even though we're a small organization, and maybe it is because we're a small organization, we're increasingly wary about applying for funds where levels of reporting are just too time consuming when compared to the amount of money that is received. And I'm sure you all know this already and have experienced it, but once you've received the funds, it's not just about doing the work, it's about telling the funder what you've done and how you've spent the money, and much of that reporting actually happens after the project has been completed. So you need to account, well, we need to account for that. So it's really important for us to understand what the funder will require and to think carefully about our ability to meet those requirements before we even start to work on the proposal and then ultimately to submit it. So generally, at the National Trust, I usually spend about half of my time either writing project proposals or reporting on projects. And I'll be honest, it can be absolutely exhausting and frustrating, especially when those proposals aren't successful. But when the work is important enough to us, we just revise the proposals, try to change them to meet the application requirements without losing the focus of what it is that we really want to do. And we have found that over time, it does get easier to write these applications. So I know this is a really general presentation, and we probably just barely touched the surface, but hopefully we'll be able to get into more of the details through the question and answer period. So that's it for me, and I'll pass it back to you, Stuart. Thank you.
Great, Farah. That's fantastic, and I'm sure that a lot of what you said resonated with those on the training. It certainly did with me. I joke, but that's why I'm a little bleary-eyed today, because we didn't really do a concept note ahead of time of the proposal we're working on with a partner. And actually, there's 5 partners. So I feel your pain when something doesn't come through when you're doing this work. It's always great when it does, but it has to be sort of the right fit. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Switching gears just a little bit in terms of the angle that we're approaching projects and the training. I want to go to my friend Greg Guanel at the University of the Virgin Islands and have him present a bit of his view of this, as he and I also have worked on proposals together in the past, and unfortunately unsuccessfully. But Greg, over to you, because I know you have had success, and from the university standpoint and the center have some interesting views on this. So over to you.
Yes, good morning, everyone. The lack of success is actually also a good thing sometimes in terms of lesson learned, and I will touch upon that in a second. So my name is Greg Guanel, and I work at the university. Before working at the university, I was working for the Nature Conservancy, where we were looking at and trying to get out of projects. And before that, I was working with Stanford University, where we were also doing the same thing, looking for projects and applying for projects that have to do with coastal conservation. So I'm going to try to draw upon my, many years of experience and give some thoughts from my perspective, as Stuart just mentioned. I think that we all have a bunch of ideas, or we see a problem that we want to fix based on our ideas and based on the sort of concept and values that we have. And so then the question becomes, how are we going to find the funding in order for us to make those dreams that you have for a particular site, or those dreams that you have for a particular topic, a reality? How can you make them reality? And so you make them, here in this context, we make them through projects that are funded by, either government or foundation or other type of sources. And so the question is, how do we craft that project? How do we think about that project for it to be successful? And I would say that, there is a lot of things that my colleagues mentioned earlier, so I won't try to repeat them. But I would say that, once you have your project idea, we kind of need to think about, what type of project are we really going to be talking about? Is it going to be a pilot project where you're going to be proposing and testing an idea? Or is it going to be a demonstration project, something that will be successful and you want others to replicate it? And so, the project will make a change, and that, and you're going to bring other people to it to say, hey, look at what I've done, you can do the same. Or is it just a straight conservation project where, there is a particular problem at a particular site, you're going to go fix it, and hopefully it's going to be okay after that? So sort of identifying the project is important, but also, depending on what you have, you can frame or reframe that project based on the type of audience that is available and the type of funding that is available. You can have a pilot project, you can frame it in a way and build it in a way that it becomes a conservation or a demonstration project, or any other way around. Basically, what I'm saying is that from my experience, it's very rare that you get exactly what you want, especially at the beginning. And a lot of flexibility in terms of framing of the project is required, especially when we're talking about conservation. And that leads to this idea of, partners. Identifying those partners is critical. And from the very beginning, understanding the role of those partners, not only technical, but financial. There are partners for whom, you're going to be 50-50 sort of thing in terms of technical capacity, but also funding. Everybody receives the same amount of money for the effort that will have to be done. And that's completely fine. And that happens, I think, in most cases. Everybody provides, some level of effort, and they are compensated for that, and everybody, is happy. However, there are other times where you can also reach out to some partners and see if they can provide, some of their own sort of resources to help meet the objectives and still meet the budget. And so usually those are larger organizations such as the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International or others. It's not always the case because they are also looking for funding on a constant basis. But there might be projects that they might be amenable to some type of partnership with you where they provide a fair amount of services that they might not be fully compensated for. So thinking about the type of partners, not only from a technical point of view, but also from a financial point of view, but also from an image point of view. And I think Alex mentioned that earlier of, local funders prefer local organization. So can you create a partnership, with those? And this is the hard part. Those partnerships are not, sometimes they can be opportunistic. So, oh, hey, I have this idea, I never talked to you about it, or you don't know me, but you want to partner with me. And that can work and that can happen. But most of the time you rely on your network. And I'm sure you guys have a strong network, but cultivating that network and really sort of, making sure that you have a broad network of friends and contacts that you can tap into when desires is quite critical especially when you're looking for those partners. Another thing that I think is important, and I'm realizing it more and more as time passes, is that especially for those projects that are not funded by local government, it's very important that you start creating ties with the local government and ties with the local stakeholders, and sort of check with them if your ideas actually are working with their ideas. Because you might be saying, oh, it's very important that we preserve this part of the coastline because of this and that sort of ecosystem value that they provide. But does that value is the value of the local population or the local stakeholders or the local government? And and if not, what are their values? So in general, you want them to sort of be okay with what you propose, but it might be that they don't care, or it might be that it's actually not exactly what they wanted. And your project might be successful in terms of you can do it and stuff like that, but long term, it might not be successful because they can be turned into something else if there is an opportunity by the local stakeholders, or it can just sort of not be replicated or fail because of lack of maintenance or other things. So it's very important to kind of figure out how does my idea work with the idea or the values of the local stakeholders, and is there opportunity for win-win? And that goes back to the point that I was making earlier about what is the project? Is it a pilot project? Is it a demonstration project, or is it a conservation project? And what is the communication that I will have to make with the stakeholders for them to understand the purpose, the intent, and long-term, what does that mean, and the role that they have to play. And I would say that the more you can bring those local partners on board, even if they are not going to be contributing technically or financially, the better, because ultimately you want them to serve as a champion for your project. Just a few more things. I think I'm getting a little bit over time. Going back to Stuart's point, and I think what Fanny also said, don't look at failure as failure. Yes, failure can be costly because you spend time and effort, and you really might want to have that funding for you to sustain your operation. And so I know that, and it can be quite stressful. At the same time, all those projects that you've written, the fact of going through the motion can really help for future endeavors, because you have templates, you have text, you have thinking, you also have partners that you can tap into and make the next proposal even stronger. So think about the future, and think about leveraging what you have already with what you want to do, or what you have done with what you want to do, or what you're going to be doing. Or as you're writing this project, have a sense of what you want to do after. And so it really goes back to this definition of the project and how it fits in the overall framework of the mission of your organization. And I think Stuart mentioned of not chasing grants, and I think that's a little bit where this sort of issue of not chasing grants come in, is really sort of thinking about these long-term strategic goals that you have, how this project fit that long-term strategic goal, and if it doesn't fully fit that strategic goal, how you can frame it in a way that it does, so that there is still this leveraging that you can do in the future, and there is still that win-win solution. And the last thing I would say is that more and more, this issue of conservation seems to be less popular than maybe one would want to, and so be flexible. I was working for some organization where you have die-hard ecologists, where it's like, we do this for nature and for nature only. I think this type of thinking is going away, but still, I would say be flexible in the sort of values and the approach and the framing, even if it's not 100% what you believe in, in your heart. Really think about the end goal. Is this going to help what I want? So can I give a little bit to those partners, or even in the language that I use, can I be a bit less stringent? Less stringent in order for me to achieve what I want. And again, thinking about, it's a pilot project, or it's a demonstration project, or you know, it's a conservation project or it's just a project to build a partnership, like really having a clear idea of what you want to get out of that project beyond just, you know, the turning dirt, as we would say, I would say is very important. So those are my remarks. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Greg. And glad you ended the way you did, as we were starting to think about, and we run through the core content in very brief form for the next couple of slides, and then we'll open it up to questions. I just wanted to remind everyone, I put it in the chat, but drop your questions into the question box area, and we can field those. Domitil and Fanny and others will keep watching, as will I. Anytime along the presentations, feel free to drop a question in there. Okay, let's go to the next slide and get into the guidebook content a little bit now. So this first part of it is around the moving into the actual application and choosing the donor. And you heard from all of our speakers about what that can actually mean. And you've heard Greg talked about the idea behind it, solving for a problem. It's something that we are always trying to be sure that we're doing, although sometimes we see a call for proposals and it looks very interesting and it's a good amount of money, or there may be some combinations. So the little red flag there is to say, are we doing the grant chasing, or are we doing a strategic step or needed research or doing a solution, solving for a problem that we've outlined as part of our overall goal? And you heard Farah talk about that because of the way that they do their work on the ground, on island, and where you are, it's a similar situation. It should evolve from the organizational and programmatic plan. And as we noted, there's an idea, a need or demand, and or opportunity that directs us that way. Next slide. So part of what we mentioned in the guidebook is to, and there's a series of steps with this, doing the pre-proposal, the project development, the project definition, and really making sure that there's a fit with the organization, and also the programmatic pieces, because often, and Greg mentioned this as well, does it thematically align with what you're doing from a strategy standpoint at your organization, or the program that's being developed? Is it part of a bigger initiative and you're doing a small part of it? And then inside of that, we want to make sure that it's done if you're a somewhat larger organization, or there's 3 or 4 staff that have to combine themselves, both on the organizational side for the grant writing, but also on developing it for the program. Bringing in the logic model, creating the action plan, developing the budget. Quite often, you'll have nonprofits that are kind of in a middle stage, and they will find themselves wanting to really go after a grant from the programmatic side. And the development or grant writer or the leadership may not be there with them, or vice versa sometimes happens, right? You get excited about something that's come out, and at the same time, no one is on the programmatic side helping that. And you heard Farah mention the concept note, and as well as my joke about not necessarily following it all the time. What we have always tried to do, and what we've laid out in the guidebook, is to be sure that there's a common and consistent way of doing that pre-proposal and the concept note. And part of this is, especially if you're including a lot of partners, can you do this in a way that sort of tests whether or not the program or the project should be followed on, and that the application should be followed on. We call them gates, to be sure that they really align with the strategy, and getting a consistent pre-proposal that decision makers, programmatic people, finance, accounting, whatever it might be, especially if it's driven by a grant writer, can all look at. Next slide. So in terms of the concept note, there's an outline and a form inside the guidebook. And I think we have to ask ourselves that series of questions around, is it consistent yet flexible, depending on the type of application that you want to do, or a funder you want to approach, or is it something you're using internally just to start to vet what a possible program project looks like? And does it include staff involvement that's broad enough and build up to an application? One of the things that we try to do at one of my organizations is have a kind of pre-proposal short form, then a concept note, boilerplate that was consistent, that could lead to an application or to like a memorandum of understanding or a partnership agreement, so that you were kind of building. And if anywhere along the way you wanted to stop that, you could do so. So some example sections you see here on the screen, and there's more detail inside the guide. But in particular, of course, it's important that you're looking at the objectives and the outputs and the outcomes, and what the activities and deliverables are connected to who you have in the organization and or with your partners, and the budget and timing for it. Quite often, and that's the last point there in the parentheses, we're looking at a specific funder, and so we can note that thematically and organizationally we're well aligned. Sometimes you're just developing something to start the process inside, but to do it consistently and allow for staff input so that you can move to the application process is really important. Next slide. So if you've started from scratch and you have just a concept note or a pre-proposal, what you might be doing, and we talk about this a lot in our other trainings, is you might be looking for internal budgets or you might be looking for external budgets. Most of the time it's external. You heard from all three presenters about the way that that often works, whether they're giving or receiving, and the pattern that they've developed or have been through in doing the work. And so if you're going outside, which is most of the cases that we're talking about here, what kind of funding is it? Is it public or private? Is it a foundation? Is it actually a large global NGO, conservation NGO, or some other type of entity? Is it hyper-local? Is it something very close in, regional or global? For some of you that we see on the registration, it might be financing like loan or equity, because you might be doing some kind of social business. Or for most of us, is it funding from a grant standpoint or sponsorship subsidies in kind? And a word of caution there, of course, because if you have too much of what is mostly subsidy or in kind, you may be working just as hard for the small amount, and Farah was alluding to this, than a large amount. $30,000 grant might end up taking you as much time and cost you as much staff time or staff involvement as something that was much, much bigger. So balancing that. And then of course, if there's an existing call for proposals, that has a whole pattern to it that often all of us, that's the one I was working on until midnight last night, it's a call for proposals on an energy resilience project, right? Working with 6 different partners. You might have to bring all of these pieces together and move into it when you're looking at that kind of outside support. Next slide. So this starts to get into the greater details of that, of identifying those sources of funding. You'd be surprised how many times we start into this without really looking at the donor specifics. A good program person as your partner, if you're writing or if you're an executive director or you are a program head, really needs to take the time to look at the background information, not just what's on the website. Download those documents and look at all the strategy, the call for proposal, and all the guides. So much of this is done online now, although there are often the cases where you're going to have things that you have to mail or email in, and you can't do everything online and just attach documents. So getting to the heart of the specifics, and if you have the luxury of having somebody who's helping you do that as a grant writer, full-time or part-time, or a development officer or something like that, obviously that helps you because you have somebody who's really kind of there to support. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's just you. For those of you that are very small institutions, it's partners in you, and you're all in working on it. That also goes for inside the project and programmatic side of things. What are the allowances for funding? What are the internal and external versions of that? What are any kind of restrictions? What are payment schedules? Farah touched on the fact that like sometimes you might have a really, really good grant, but it's all done through reimbursements. And so you have to have the operating or existing funds so that you can do the work and then have the funds come in afterwards. It's very difficult if you don't have upfront payments. So you have to check all of that. And then really the eligibility of the organization, the structure, its location, geography. It may require that you have a partner who is, for instance, in the EU or is based in the Caribbean or both, or any number of things. And all of you will have experienced that in some way probably, and I certainly have, and so have our speakers as they noted. Next slide. So a few logos thrown up here just to kind of get you thinking, but depending on where you are, because we have participants from the Caribbean, from Fiji, from other places in the Pacific, and all around Europe and Africa and around the Med. Any one of these or all of them may be on your list or have been on your list in the past, depending on the type of funding, where they're funding, and the timing. And many of these institutions you're probably familiar with. Some may be new to you, but granted, each of them kind of functions differently. And so that's why we're saying there are so many to choose from, that being very specific about where your strategy and their program really align, so that what you're doing is something that reinforces what you're already doing if possible, or a program that you're developing internally as the grant supports come along. Next slide. I know it's coming. There it is. And that's our cue. So if we can have our speakers turn on their mics, we'll see if there are questions. Certainly you can come on camera, maybe Alex, not you, with the bandwidth issue. And let's see what kind of questions and answers we can jump into here.
And Stuart, I just wanted to say I did a note in the chat about your point about reimbursable. That's a big problem, especially if you have a large grant and not a large operating funds. And what I've seen others do is to partner with larger organizations that have that bandwidth, that have that cash reserve, and you just sub for them. And those discussions need to be had up front. And that's another thing that maybe I didn't mention, is anything related to budget and authorship needs to be discussed at the very beginning of a project, because they tend to be sticky later, and you don't want at the last minute to have those issues sort of be raised. So, it's great to talk about ideas, but you need to talk about the money side very, very early, and who owns the project. That's right.
That's right. Yeah, partnering is wonderful and painful, I like to say sometimes. So
I like partnering with you.
that may be your pain point. Let's see, Domitille, any questions we can bring forward to the panelists?
Hi everyone, we do not have any questions on the chat, but I would ask maybe a question on how do you choose the, it would be more an advice than a question, but from our experience at SMILO, so I'm a project coordinator at SMILO, so I'm in charge of writing proposals and implementing and managing projects that we have. But at SMILO, we also have an island fund, and we fund projects up to 50,000 euros on small islands. So we also have the donors role. And one of the advice is to, before starting writing proposals, to identify what are the donors that are related to the topics of your organization, and to make sure that you have you follow their activity on social media, if they have a newsletter, to register to their newsletters, because it happens a lot of time that 2 days before the end, the deadline of a project proposal opportunities, we discover these project proposal opportunities, and then it's the rush and it's too late to make a proper and a quality proposal. So it's always better to have the information as soon as the funding opportunity is available. So, and in order to do this, you need to pre-identify the donors and to make sure that you are on the good communication channel they use to get this information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do see now a couple of questions. Thank you, Domitil. And for those of you who
Domitil, I think that is.
Go ahead, Alex.
I think there's a delay, but I was just going to say that I completely agree with Domitil. And as from my experience as a funder, something like 90%, if you open a round of funding, you get 100 applications, more than 90 will come through in the last 48 hours. And the less than 10 that come through before that, it can even help you to stand out, because people are, oh, they've submitted a week before the deadline, and you know, I might have a read of this. Whereas when you're as a grant maker, when you get like a selection of 20 or 30 applications to read, you can only give so much time to each one, and if you're not doing it at the very last minute, it can help.
Yeah, absolutely. For all of the speakers, there's a question around what the ideal number of partners in a project is. Any thoughts on that? I have my own thoughts, but I'll turn it to all three of you. What's the ideal number of partners in a project?
I think, from my experience, I would say that something like 3 would be good. It really depends on the size of the project, first of all. But I would say that for the projects that I worked on, 3 is good. 3 partners that have equal voice, or that have, you know, that can make decision as the project is implemented. And if there are more partners, then they can be considered as, you know, sub-recipients or contractors, or whatever term works for the grant that you have, where, you know, they don't have sort of a say, and they just do something based on, you know, a scope of work. Because for the project I worked on, you know, there's the proposal and there's the doing, and the doing is usually, you know, sometimes for simple projects it's okay, but for more complex projects there is some deviation that happens, and some critical thinking that is required. And, you know, that leadership team, if it's too big, it's just chaos. And I think 3 is probably a good number where you can have good dialogue and move on. So I think it's the part of my answer is it depends how you define partners. But if you're talking about leadership role, I would say 3. After that, I would say it depends on the type of skills that you are needed, and and the type of organization that you want to partner with. So this is my answer.
Great, thanks, Greg. Farah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it depends on the type of project and what skills or expertise you need to bring on. But like Greg said, you might not need them as full partners. They could just be contracted as either consultants or as contractors. For us, I think it also depends on what role are we taking on. So are we going to be the ones leading the project, or are we a partner on the project and someone else is taking on that sort of administrative responsibility? And in that case, for us, it doesn't really matter how many partners there are, as long as we're able to accomplish what it is that we need to do. When we are partnered, or when we're the leads, yeah, I agree, anything more than 3 becomes very difficult, especially if you have to be dispersing funds yourself to those partners, because just the financial management aspect beyond the implementation side of things can get quite difficult.
Yeah, that's great. And I think with the experiences you've had and what Greg mentioned, we have a pretty good selection of the kinds of lead versus follow grant applications and the types of partners. Certainly that's been my experience as well. Right now, the one I'm working on, we're one of 6, but I'm not the lead, so that saves me a lot of the extra agony. Alex, do you want to add anything to what Greg and Farah said?
If I can, just I agree with everything that was said. I think 3, perhaps, to me, the number is not so important as every partner defined and role. And if I sort of reflect on those which were really dysfunctional or have been really dysfunctional in the way that they've been, it's often where there are, for example, perhaps 3 universities have come together to run a project, and then there's 3 partners in a big program of work already. Academics, all with 3 competing research interests, same structure at the institution. That's a really good example of a recipe for a really difficult time. There can be more partners for that, as long as it's really clearly well defined what they're all doing, and there's a different role for each that suits their strengths as an institution. Otherwise, you get a situation of too many cooks spoiling the broth.
Yeah. Yes, I'm in that moment right now, and I think we've figured out who are the cooks and who are the oh gosh, I won't have the right metaphor here, but the sous chef who's just preparing things so that everyone else can do the deeper work. There's a couple of other questions, and I think Mohammed's we answered. Alex made a point about that in the way that the first impression is made. Martina asked a question about some of the funders shown, and we didn't show the many others. And I think it's an important note about the kind of funding, because there may be a direct science-based grant that can go to a researcher that is not the same as a large organizational grant. There's also some funders out there now, and they're not in that list or those logos that you see, but are very focused, for instance, on outreach communications and projects that are around education and training. So this goes back to the question of what is it that you're trying to do and solve or work towards, and where's the match for it, and is it the right fit, and can you blend it to make it fit appropriately? But there are definitely funders in that mix who do smaller research projects and outreach from a science standpoint, and we can circle back to that offline as well. So let's move on with the next section and move to the next slide. if you're not on, and if you're not on right now for our speakers, please mute. Alex, are you able to move the slide? Or, yep. Oh. Not sure if we're having another difficulty in terms of moving the slides. Okay, we may have completely lost Alex, so therefore.
I'm here, I just haven't heard anything for the last 5 minutes myself.
Oh, strange. Okay, yeah, can you move to the next slide?
Sure.
Sorry. All right, so this is the second phase. We're moving into the more specifics, right? And what you see on the left-hand side of your screen comes directly from the materials, from the guidebook. And the process that we described in very short form in terms of identifying that application process and everything that comes with it. What are the type of materials? Is it online? Is it emailed in? Is it a fillable PDF? And is it more than one round? Do you apply for a first phase and then move on to a second phase? That's not necessarily noted here, but there might be, and I've been through some where there's 3 phases. There's a letter of interest, and then there's an application, and then you're down to a finalist list. That can be pretty burdensome, and as Farah noted, you know, when you don't get it, there's that sense of disappointment, especially after one that has so many steps to it. And we mentioned that this at the beginning, but also working together on the application so that the co-design happens and the programmatic development, finance, and leadership are all engaged so that this is not something that's coming from one side of the organization or another. And if there's a way to do this, as Alex kind of alluded to, ahead of time, get it in early and have it be organized around the strategy. So this sort of linear view that you see here on the left means that we get to the certain point and it's a question of whether it's accepted or whether it's not accepted. Next slide. And as we move to the next slide, you know, the thing that we want to make sure that we're continuing to think about, and it's been mentioned by all the speakers in terms of the way that you partner, or you might have consultants or contractors, and whether you're the lead or not. The people working on the proposal may not even be the ones that work on the project, especially at bigger institutions or where you're very small and you're partnered with a bunch of different people. So you're trying to create a project team to kind of draft and co-design the application, and you want to share the information across your organization and with the other partner organizations, but also pull from inside your institution, especially if it's a larger one, and make sure that you're aligned. You heard from all the speakers about how that can go when it's not. It may be, in the cases for some of you, that your application team, because of you're kind of right-sized and you're at the right point in time, may go on to run the project. They may do the implementation and the actual program management and delivery. And it's mentioned in the guidebook too, and there's kind of a description. Who's the project manager then, or the project director, and how does that work inside the organization and relate to things like just even grant reporting and the outcomes evaluation, monitoring, etc. And of course, it's noted as well, and all of us are familiar with this, which gets to Alex's point about that due date. If you can work backwards from the due date, and this was why I had to have the materials ready for tomorrow, for today from last night. The due date is October 12th, but we're trying to get it done ahead of time. And so that's really important if you're trying to be early or be early enough and work backwards from that particular due date. Alex, can we move forward? So once the application is in, you know that even as you're developing the application, you are attempting to align your narrative, right? You're looking to make sure that the narrative inside the document actually fits with a work plan that will come inside the organization. And there are a number of different ways that a work plan can be developed, but the kind of Gantt chart style, we're all probably familiar with. You see an example there on the right that comes right from the guidebook. But making sure that that which becomes the work plan, the action plan for the organization to deliver and implement is part of what's described. As a grant reviewer, as well as writer, I have often seen where what really has to happen to do the work doesn't necessarily sync up with the narrative, because the narrative is trying to be very convincing about the organization or the program that's intended. And aligning that narrative with the budget is probably one of the most important things in terms of, especially what the speakers have already noted, but also with reality. It's a bit of a cheeky way of saying it, but we know that we're eager to create these programs and run them, and sometimes that gets in the way of doing it from a strategic way so that these narratives line up with the work plan that eventually has to be done. Next slide. And as we're doing that, we want to make sure that, Farah mentioned this already, using a logic model or a logic framework, and starting to, and this gets to those early documents, even the concept note or pre-proposal. What are the objectives and the sub-objectives, and all of the activities, results, deliverables, and indicators? How are you differentiating outputs from outcomes? I'll talk about that in a second. But using, and this is from the guide, this particular a version that you see on the screen here, but there are lots of ways to show the logical framework template or logic model so that it's consistent, much like your pre-proposal concept note type of instruments. Is there something you can use again and again that everybody is familiar with and trained up on? We made sure to develop that partnership and program and development process with one of the organizations I work with, and now we try to use that every single time so that we're moving consistently and bringing people in at the right time. Next slide. And so this is an oft debated issue, outputs versus outcomes. I happen to grab a definition and did some edits on it that I like. An output details what the organization does through the project, whereas an outcome defines changes that have taken place because of the work through that project. And there's often strategic or organizational outputs and outcomes, and you know what those are, and the grant or the program or project should be aligning to that. So you might describe the project's deliverables as outputs and the project outcomes as indicators, and it's something that you can measure. It may be that if it's a concept note that's brand new, you might be developing outputs and outcomes that are completely new to the organization, and you need to be sure that they're embedded in the strategy or in the overall view that the organization has in terms of the work it does. So the measurement of the impact is something you can then report on, right? And if you have a grant officer, they're going to ask you these questions over and over again. What is it that our impact is? How are we reporting on it? How do we prove we've done what we've done, both from the output and the outcome standpoint? Next slide. It's not last, but the budget, Greg mentioned it as well, making sure that the the budget and its breakdown is done early and often, and that you're covering costs, especially if it's something where you are the lead and there are multiple partners or subcontractors or other organizations. And if you're an organization that already has operating funds, what are the direct expenses associated with the project, and what are those that are connected to the organization that support the project that are indirect? And are there indirect or overhead percentages that you can bill or put into the grant? Some, including those with the logos we showed you, like GIZ and others, have very strict caps on what that amount is that helps support your organization. There has been a movement in the global foundation world, especially coming out of the States and Europe, to make sure that NGOs of all sizes are not getting short shrift on their costs, and that the ability for an organization to continue to exist is not so burdensome from the sense of what a grant can supply or not supply. Because what's happened in the past is those overhead costs and indirect costs are not being well supported by institutions. And so it's an ongoing argument all the time. But when you run into a place like GIZ, there are no negotiations. It's, I think, 10%, and that's it. It might even be less than that. It might be 8%. So familiarize yourself with that, because you can do a program that gets paid, but all the other support work that comes with it, like your administration, your finance, and your other pieces, may not be included. And so you have to have that covered somehow as an organization. Next slide. So we have gone through this process. We've checked the boxes. We are ready to submit. We've done everything we described, plus more, as is in the methodological guide. And you've hit the deadlines, and you're early, and you've sent it in. So then we wait. Next slide. We want to hope that it's on the left-hand side of the column and that the project is accepted and that you're going to receive the funding. But sometimes, of course, you're going to get rejected. And Farah mentioned that at the very beginning. It happens quite a lot. And you normally, I guess in my experience anyway, you normally receive some sort of assessment. It's not always that valuable. I recently was partnered on 3 or 4 different grants, and we received very, very, very thorough assessments and feedback, and yet of the 4, none of them were received. So great feedback, no money, no program support. So that right-hand side is something to cause reflection. And on the left, then you start into the process of really where you're headed in terms of the development of the project. And more than likely, it takes a little bit of time if you have to sign an MOU or a partnership agreement and get the details down. And then you're looking at the actual funding and the actual layout of the project, which we'll talk about in our later sessions. Next slide. So now we are going to talk a little bit more, take some more Q&A. I think we have some other questions in the platform. And Domitille, if you see any that are particularly interesting, grab them and let me know. Okay, so I misunderstood Mohammed, and it is a good clarification, and this I think this is important. I won't answer it from my point of view. Alex brought up something that was related to this. So the question is whether or not the last-minute submissions are bad, or if it doesn't matter as long as it's submitted on time or within the deadline. So this is a more specific and tricky question. Let's see what others have to say about that. Greg and Farah.
Sorry, could you repeat that again, Stuart?
So he's asking, is a last-minute submission bad, or does it not matter as long as the project was submitted within the deadline? So it's kind of gets back to what Alex noted about how if it's early, there's more time, and when you're a reviewer, you get 20, 30 at a time. So it's an important question as to timing of delivery of a grant application.
So from my point of view, excuse me, I'm not too sure. I was actually surprised to hear that when Alex made the statement. And I would say that it depends on who's the funding organization is. And because I have reviewed proposals for various organizations, and they just say, hey, you are somebody who receive a bunch of stuff, can you review these or that? And so there has been some work that the funding organization has done, to then disseminate to reviewers. Maybe smaller organization review in-house with their staff, and it really depends on the process and the reviewing process, if it's one person in charge or if it's a committee. If it's a committee, I would be extremely surprised if everybody in the committee receive things as they arrive. If it's one person, yeah, maybe Alex's point needs to be taken. So I think it depends. And I think that what would be good, which is something we need to do no matter what, is to build a relationship with those smaller organizations. It will allow you to have a better understanding on their reviewing process. If it's a committee, if it's two people, if it's 5 people, or if it's or if they send it to other person. And it will also it's also a good thing to know, because they will alert you when something is coming up, or they might have some extra fund and think about you outside of the proposal sort of cycle. So creating this partnership with funders is always a good thing. And I would say that my answer is it depends to the question that was asked.
Ara, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I know that he added that as a small organization, we do this 90% of the time, send it in at the last minute. And I know that would be the case for most of the grants that I am part of and put in. Farah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're the same. I'm usually down to the last hour of the deadline, just because, well, it's not about procrastinating, it's about making sure that we've actually answered everything to the best that we could actually do. But what I find with our applications, or to whom we're submitting these applications, they usually have templates based on how they grade the proposals. So, and it's quite clear, it might be 5 points for a clear impact statement or a well thought out log frame. So you kind of have an idea of, how they're assessing, and usually it's not based on when you submit. But again, it probably depends. For like Alex and what Greg said, if it's a small organization and they're putting in they're supporting the projects, then yeah, they might be looking at projects as they come in. But generally, I think for the larger proposals, you just need to make the deadline.
Yeah, and I think that's why this training and having actual stakeholders who are in the field doing this work with all of you who are participants can talk reality, because that is so often the case. I really hope with this one that I'm working on right now, it doesn't go until the last hour, but so many times that is the case. Just if we're talking reality, great to get it in early. Most of us don't have the luxury. Most of you don't have the luxury of that. Other questions? Let's see. Yeah, I think we covered them. looking at the time, Domitille, let's jump to the key terms and steps review, the checklist. So just a quick review, because the next session, of course, will start to dive deeper because you've received the grant. You're going to run the project or program. And so thinking back and sort of what we talked about and the longer bits of this that are in the guidebook, making sure that for the first phase, choosing the donor and the call for proposals, that you're doing all of the internal and external analysis, the organizational and programmatic strategy, and that pre-proposal that sort of matches with your internal checks, and the way that that looks on the outside for communication. Apparently, both my dogs think it's time to stop. And then if you're looking at those sources of funding, what's the fit? Again, try not to do the grant chasing, because that makes it much more difficult if you've chased a grant and that doesn't align well, and then be able to come as part of the strategy of the organization. And then as you actually work on the project draft, it may be you by yourself with a person or a partner, it may be a whole team. Since you've done that first phase of work, you should be able to move into that concept note and into the application and partnership agreements and start to do the whole narrative and work plan and budget, so that that's set up ahead of time if indeed you're successful, because then you sort of are turning on the switch and you're all aligned already. That sometimes is not the case, because sometimes, and I think Farah alluded to this as well, you might be writing a grant that then causes you to hire consultants that you've asked to be part of a pitch, and then you propose it and you get it, and then you have to kind of ramp up and get ready. Even with a larger organization, some of whom I work for, you get a big grant and it means a big program. We have one right now that we're starting, and we're actually hiring people because of the grant came in, and a portion of it is used for a special fund. So therefore, like with SMILO, there may be portions of your operation that you're actually passing on to others, folks like you on the call, those of you that are actually doing the work on the ground. So then you move to those final steps. It may be the acceptance and the rollout of the program and project and setting up the systems internally. You might be resubmitting, or you might be looking at it and saying, you know what, we're not going to go back for this. In some cases, and it has happened to me and many of you on the call, I'm sure, where they've asked you to come back later, or it's a not right now. It's not a no, but it's a not right now. Come back later and fix these things. So I'm always hopeful that will be the case, and that there's something to learn from when that does happen. So what we're going to do now, we're over time, but we're glad that a number of you have stuck with us. So we're going to open up for our live discussion. We can move forward and open the discussion up for everyone, and see if there are further questions that we want to tackle, and ask our speakers. Alex had to leave at the mark, but we have Farah and Greg with us, and of course Domitille and myself. So let's do that. And if we don't have any immediate questions, I have some that I'd love to talk to Farah and to Greg about, and we can see as other questions come in, because we have almost our entire crew of attendees still. So I think for the benefit of the participants, Greg and Farah, you can see that a lot of the questions come from the level to which they are and what they're working on as an organization, and in particular for the size of organizations that we're dealing with. I'd love to hear from the two of you how we avoid, or how they avoid, doing the kind of grant chasing that so often happens as an organization, as organizations grow, or as they begin a program. And I know that's a little bit of a trap in terms of a question, but would love to hear your thoughts on that. How do you make sure that you're doing it in an aligned way and not just chasing a grant? Oh, sorry, I didn't have my camera on either. So Farah, why don't we start with you and then we can move to Greg.
Sure. So I'll be honest. When I first joined the National Trust here, there was only 3 of us, and then my boss left, so we were down to 2. And we were just really trying to grow the organization. So we were chasing money. It was the only way that I could get staff. So we would, change our programs around to fit what we had to do to get the funds. Now we're in a much better position, and it's partly because we started to take a more strategic approach to the work that we were doing. So we created 5-year strategic plans. We outline, what our priority programs are. We have our implementation schedule within those strategic plans, and we identify where, which programs and projects we would need additional funding. Like I said, though, Anguilla is a UK overseas territory, so our funding options are very limited. We can apply to funds from the UK, sometimes from the US, but because of Brexit, we're no longer going to be able to access EU funds. Because we're an overseas territory, we can't access some funds that are available for independent Caribbean countries. So we kind of know what funding mechanisms are actually available to us now, and we know which ones actually fit our program areas. But because we do conservation work on the ground, we also, when we're developing our strategic plan, we can sort of see where there are gaps and which gaps the National Trust, as long as we work within our mandate, can actually fill. So right now, when we do develop project proposals, they are very much in line with our strategic plan. I don't know about you, Greg.
Yeah,
Thanks,
it's
Farah.
a difficult question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Stuart.
No, I was just saying, thanks, Farah. Go ahead, Greg, and I'll follow up after you say something.
No, I think it's a difficult thing to do to avoid. As Farah mentioned, having a strategic plan is critical. Even when you're not chasing dollars, having a strategic plan is critical. At CGTC, we created a strategic plan, and it really helped communicate to the, I have a staff of 2, but it helped us really think about, okay, is it worth pursuing a particular, opportunity or not? And it helps communicate among us, why are we doing what we're doing? Because something can, snowball into something else before you even realize it, especially if you're passionate about a particular topic. So I would say that, having a strategic plan and communicate that plan to your team and even to your partners is very useful, because they also know what is it that, you care about, what is it that you're doing. So I agree with Farah on the strategic planning. I would say that, the other thing that I've learned and heard and seen is, if possible, try to identify and cultivate donors, people who will just give you forgot the term, but basically money without too many conditions, because they love your organization. It's not that easy to do, but it's also not unfeasible to identify those groups or those people, philanthropic kind of folks who might want to donate to your organization. And what it will do is it will provide you with not all the funds that you need, but enough, hopefully, funds for you to not always be, or should I print this or not because it's, another 25 cents sort of, cost that is going to go out. So it will provide you with a little bit of a buffer for you to then be a little bit more choosy and intentional when you write your grant. So, identify a donor or work with somebody who can help you identify a donor is another way of sort of avoid the chasing of the grant. And then the last thing I would say is that as you chase the grant, and there's nothing wrong per se with it, you might have to do that. Think about how will that allow you to go to something bigger later. And, so don't sort of stay within that cycle of chasing, and at some point you chase so much you lose balance or you lose focus. Always think about, okay, what is the longer goal? What is the longer goal? And how I can use that little funding to then justify getting something bigger that will eventually allow me to, be okay for a year, 2 years without thinking. And that goes back to the strategic planning. So that's my answer.
Great, and a couple of things both of you touched on. One was the potential for funding that Farah's describing with Brexit and the kinds of funders that you can approach for the type of organization that you are. But the other is you both touched on kind of operational grants versus the programmatic grants, and we're in particular talking about the projects. And we don't dive too deep in the methodological guide or in this training, but one of the things that relates to those overhead costs that's very difficult for organizations is to find those funds that are core funds that allow you to operate that are not tied to a project or program, right? This is an entire massive discussion in every organization I work with, because sometimes, especially if you're a network or you're a membership association or organization or a university, you need solid core funding and operations, right? So what we're talking about today doesn't necessarily go into that territory. It does make it much easier if, for instance, with the trust, Farah's noting that they've been able to raise money and have staff, building that momentum is possible. But one of the things that has definitely hurt nonprofits, and you see them come and go, is if you're not able to have those sort of core funding, or if your funding availability changes. And Farah noted that as well, right, with Brexit. Again, just a reminder to all the participants, you see it on the screen. If you have a question, click your little hand button, and we'll see that. And I noted in the chat that we're going to go to the top of the hour. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and I will also keep the conversation going with Greg and Farah. For both of you, especially working in the Caribbean, just a question: for others that are in other parts of the world or that are doing work in the Caribbean, what are the funders and topics, themes, and institutions that you feel like are giving more opportunities for coastal projects, natural projects like this, islands, and kind of developing resilient coastlines? Any good advice at this point about those types of funders, by name, or if you don't want to name, by category or theme? Where do you think it's going? Because I know, Greg, you mentioned that there's been a downtick in some of the conservation funds. Where's the positive? Is there?
So it's hard I don't know about the general Caribbean because we really only access funds that are available for UK overseas territories. But the major donor would be right now Darwin Plus, which they also have a branch which is more international, which is the Darwin Initiative, and that's a UK funding mechanism. The EU has a number of different funding mechanisms. One that we're still able to apply for, and I'm not sure if anyone from Aruba is on this webinar, but there's a funding mechanism called Resembid, and that is open now. They're still accepting concept notes, but it's a significant amount of money. Initially, I think they said that there was up to 5 million available per island, and now they've kind of changed it. So now there's this massive pot of millions of dollars that are sort of open access to any Caribbean island that is either a Dutch territory, French territory, or UK territory. Then there's GEF, which is the Global Environment Facility that funds independent countries. And then there's also funding through the OECS. And then some countries can actually access US funding as well through the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And I think maybe the US Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Then there's things like Disney, which are a little bit harder. Once you're in with Disney, you're in. But it's just getting that first project funded by them. And there are some smaller organizations like the Hamid bin Zayed Conservation Fund, Rufford Foundation, but those are smaller grants. So it just depends on, how much money you're looking for, and is it to maybe top up a larger project that you're involved in, which actually can be really helpful. And sometimes that would attract funders as well if it's a smaller amount of money to show that you've already been able to secure other funds. So those are some of the organizations or donors that we've approached. I don't know what's actually available more for like the US islands or the independent countries.
Great. Those are some great suggestions, and I forgot about the specific Dutch and UK French dollars, because that came across the plate. Greg, I don't know if you know about that, but that's a pretty interesting pot of funds. So we're getting close to having to wrap up. Let's move to the next slide, because one of the things that this day, and hopefully we got rid of all the technological issues and won't have this next time. But what today sets up is the conversation for our October conversation. And those of you that stayed with us, and thanks to so many of you who stayed all this entire 2 hours and got through our technological problems. Domitille, if you can bring up to save the date, we will be seeing you on October 21st. And again, it's at the same time, because the way that it works is each week we do French and then Portuguese and then the English. So in fact, for the folks behind the scenes, especially Fanny, this is the third webinar this week. This one in English. And so we will have the same kind of process in October, and bring all of you back and keep the process going. And I hope that you were finding some new information today. Of course, the guidebook is much more in depth, and that's going to be shared with you. And I want to say a special thanks to our speakers, to Greg and Farah and Alex, for lending their time and their knowledge and expertise and their battle scars in this work. This kind of grant writing proposal making is not easy. It's a tough process. So a special thanks to them for sharing and being open and transparent about it. Domitille, any other last words? And I think we will close up for today.
Well, thank you all for participating to this first training. We hope that it was very useful and practical for you. And we invite you to participate to the next 2 sessions. And in the meantime, we will send you the presentation. And if you have any questions to Stewart, myself, or to the speakers, we'll be happy to get in touch with you.
That's right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you in October. Thanks, Domitille and Fanny.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Farah. Have a good night. Good afternoon, everyone.
You too.